Hi, everyone. We'll get started now. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our weekly webinar series. My name is Brittany, and I'll be hosting today, and I'm tuning in from occupied Tohono O'odham land, aka Tucson. I'm the Saving Life on Earth campaigner, and I've included on my little slide, there's the native-land.ca map that you can use to find out whose land you're occupying. So with that, before I let the speakers of today's webinar introduce themselves, I just have a few little tech notes. The chat will be disabled because we heard from you all that it's really distracting. And then we'll have a question and answer section at the end. And we'll also be on Slack tomorrow from 12 to 1 p.m. to answer any questions that you have. Oh, and you'll be getting an email after this webinar with an action alert that will allow you to sign a petition, I believe, banning cyanide bombs in Texas. So with that, I'm going to allow the speakers to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Andrea Zuccardi. I'm a senior attorney with the center. I've been doing environmental advocacy and litigation for about 15 years. Started with the center in 2014, based in Victor, Idaho, out of my home office. And my focus is on carnivores and issues in the Northern Rockies that affect carnivore habitat.
And I'm Colette Adkins. I work with Andrea in the Endangered Species Program. I'm a senior attorney and the Carnivore Conservation Director. I work out of a home office in Minneapolis. Like Andrea, I graduated in 2005. I went to the University of Minnesota Law School. I also have a science background in wildlife conservation. Most of my work at the center focuses on exploitation of carnivores, and you'll see that come through when we talk about our work on wildlife services and keeping wolves protected tonight.
Awesome. Thank you both for introducing yourselves. Again, so we'll get started, but just real quick again, remember chat is disabled and we'll have question and answers at the end. So put your questions into the little Q&A box and we'll get to them later. Okay, and with that, so Collette, what is wildlife services?
Yeah, that's what I want to spend most of my time talking about tonight, because one of the challenges here is that wildlife services is such a secretive program, and we really want to get the word out about the damage that this federal wildlife killing program causes. So this is a program through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And every year it kills millions of animals. So last year, 2.6 million animals were killed. 1.5 million of those were native animals. It's mostly on behalf of the livestock industry. So killing coyotes, foxes, other carnivores that might prey on cattle or other livestock. And there's also some uses to protect crops too, like killing blackbirds to protect sunflower crops, for example. And then some smaller uses that aren't quite as controversial to protect human safety at airports, for example. But many of the targeted animals are carnivores, and of course, you're tuned in likely because you recognize, like Andrea and I do, the really important ecological value that these animals play. So we're particularly troubled by the death toll of carnivores. And I do want to explain in detail some of the numbers. And the slide that's up now, all this information is provided on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's webpage. The last time the data has been updated, though, is 2018, so that's what we need to rely on. So last year, or in 2018, they intentionally killed 357 gray wolves, over 68,000 coyotes, plus an unknown number of pups in 360 dens that were destroyed, 338 black bears, 375 mountain lions, over 1,000 bobcats, thousands of foxes, including many of these little fox pups in dens. And that's just the animals that are intentionally targeted. Hundreds and hundreds of animals accidentally die because of the methods are so often indiscriminate. So last year, they recorded that 2,700 animals, non-target animals, were killed. And we know from talking to former members of wildlife services that most of the time they don't actually report these non-targets. It is embarrassing for the agency to capture animals that they didn't intend to. But the data does show that bobcats, foxes, bears, muskrats, otters, porcupines, raccoons, turtles even, and lots of birds are accidentally killed too. You know, common beloved birds like chickadees and cardinals, eagles, hawks, owls. And unfortunately, even companion animals are sometimes caught in the traps that wildlife services sets. And what's particularly frustrating in terms of their carnivore killing program is that the science shows that it has very limited, if any, benefit. So for example, killing coyotes just often leads to just a temporary decline in their population, but the coyotes that are left then increase their reproduction because there's more resources to go around with fewer coyotes on the landscape temporarily. So they have more litters, their litters are bigger, and before you know it, the population is either back right where it was or even bigger than before. Killing canids like wolves, same story. Most of the science today is showing that it's ineffective, partly because wolves are, pack animals. They have this really important social structure. So when you indiscriminately kill some members of the pack structure breaks down. You get these lone wolves then that can't effectively take down, big game like, deer or elk, and then they have to target the easy prey, which might be, calves at a ranch. Plus it's expensive. It's a taxpayer funded service. About 100 million federal tax dollars a year are contributed. And most of the time, the way it works is that the federal government pairs with local governmental agencies. So a county or a park board or a city will contract with wildlife services, and then they do a cost sharing agreement. So it very well may be the case that even your local government is using your local tax dollars to fund that program. I'd like to talk a bit about the methods too. So here's a photo of a wildlife services officer putting up a snare. And you can imagine that devices like this, a snare is just this wire cable that tightens around either the neck or the foot of an animal, that they're quite indiscriminate because any animal that goes walking in that area can be caught. There's some things that can be done to try to make it more selective with the size of the loop and the tension of the cable. But unfortunately, too often the wrong animal gets caught and dies. So they use snares, terribly cruel devices, also leg hold traps. I mean, we've known for decades, of course, how terribly cruel those types of devices are with animals, suffering from the elements while they're caught in the devices, chewing on their legs, breaking their teeth. It's just horrific. And it's not just the animals that are caught in the traps, it's the young that are orphaned without their parents too. So it's an incredibly sad situation, which is why, I've largely dedicated my career to going at it, because I just really am bothered by it and want to do something to help it. I want to talk about one more device that Wildlife Services uses. It's the M44 cyanide bomb. Here's a photo of two Wildlife Services officers putting up a M44. These are these small little it almost looks like a sprinkler head once it's tapped into the ground. But they're found, right on our public lands. You can imagine this is just like a beautiful place where someone might be out hiking with their animals or their small children. And the way these devices work is they're baited on the top with something that smells really good to canids. And when a fox, a wolf, or even your own dog comes up and pulls on the device, then you can get the shot of cyanide up into its mouth. I might have a slide that shows, I'm not sure if that one's functioning or not. There was a slide that showed how that device worked. Yeah, there it is. So you can see the baited material at the top, and then there's the spring-loaded action that would shoot the cyanide up into the face of the animal. These devices gained a lot of attention back in 2017 because a teenager was out hiking with his dog right in the hill behind his home. I mean, you could see his home from where the incident happened. He just bent down because he was curious, like, what is this little metal thing pounded into the ground? And it went off. Luckily, it was actually a windy day, and it blew the cyanide away from the child. So he just was temporarily blinded, but luckily he didn't die. Unfortunately, though, then it blew it right to where his dog was, and the poor young man had to, he lost his dog, and it was just a horrible circumstance. And it should have never been set so close to where people live and use our public lands. So after that incident, the Center for Biological Diversity and a lot of our partner organizations really got riled up, and we just have dedicated a lot of resources to trying to get these devices banned. One of the things that we did was to ask the EPA, they're the agency that registers these devices. We asked them to cancel the devices. Unfortunately, they refused to do so, but the petition itself attracted a lot of media attention all around the world, actually. And folks like you submitted comments. Actually, more than 99.9% of the comments that were submitted asked for a complete ban on M44 cyanide bombs. But in December of last year, they went ahead and reauthorized the devices anyway. There's some good aspects. Like I said, we did draw attention to the use of these devices. And also the EPA did put some additional small protective measures in, like increasing the distance between where a residence is and where you can put the device, some additional signage requirements. But none of that is going to get at the fundamental problem, which is, endangered wildlife can't read a sign. They don't care, how close it is to a residence. And just too often these are catching the wrong animal and killing them in a terribly cruel way. So we also, besides that administrative petition, we realized that we need to work on maybe a legislative effort because the executive agency just really doesn't want to do the right thing. So we've, with a big coalition, we got Oregon to finally ban those devices. That ban went into effect at the beginning of this year. That means now all the West Coast states have bans on the devices. And in the next Congress, hopefully, this is another reason why elections matter, where if we've got the right composition of Congress, we'll introduce with some of our partners and some of our advocates in Congress to ban these devices on all federal public lands. Well, I don't want to monopolize time. Do I have time now to go into some of the litigation that we've done, Brittany?
I think so.
Okay. Well, I don't want to leave you with a bunch of sort of bad news about the awfulness here, because there is actually a lot that can be done. And we've had quite a bit of success. We've been bringing lawsuits. Andrea and I have worked together on a lot of these. We've brought lawsuits against Wildlife Services, which is the primary agency that uses them. There are some state Department of Agricultures that use them as well, but it's mostly wildlife services, and we've had success. So we've gotten restrictions in Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado. I've got my eye on Texas for the next lawsuit, which is a good part of the reason why we're using Texas for the action alert that we're going to be linking to at the end of this webinar. As the result of another lawsuit that we brought, the Fish and Wildlife Service has agreed to analyze the impacts of cyanide bombs on endangered wildlife. They've got a deadline of next year to get that analysis done. We're hoping that when that analysis shows what it should, which is that these are just way too risky for endangered wildlife, that will result in additional restrictions in places where endangered wildlife live, or maybe finally, we could get a situation where the agency does the right thing and bans them altogether. There are ways that folks like you can help in our efforts to end Wildlife Service's war on wildlife. One of the things that we've been really excited about is having local governments end their contracts with wildlife services. So remember how I was talking about that there's often this relationship with the federal government and these local governmental bodies. So, maybe a park board for a city would form into a contract with wildlife services to kill geese that, defecate in their parks. When people speak out against that, change happens. And we've seen this happen really quite frequently in the last couple of years. We've had 2 successes on that just this year in Humboldt County in California. With the help of a local resident there, we were able to negotiate so that the contract is revised so that they need to exhaust non-lethal methods. So there's a lot of ways to prevent conflict with wildlife. You don't have to go right to killing them. So, putting up lights, for example, that might scare a coyote from coming in close to the ranch, or using guard dogs or fencing. So we got the Humboldt Department of Agriculture to revise their contract. A very similar story in my hometown. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A local activist here reached out to me. He had heard that the park board had just renewed a contract with Wildlife Services to kill beaver that were harming trees in the parks, and coyotes, because someone had complained that they were afraid of coyotes that were coming out in the evenings. Same story, we worked with the local government, got them to revise that contract, and now they won't be doing any coyote killing, and they need to exhaust non-lethal methods to protect those trees, which is actually very easy. You can just wrap like a chicken wire around the base of a tree, and then the beavers won't get at them. So local advocacy does matter, and I'd be happy to talk to folks more about how they can get involved in that.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that information, Colette. And now we're going to move on and hear from Andrea about what she's been working on. So do you want to talk a little bit about the work you've been doing with grizzlies and other?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Colette. That was really informative, even though we deal with that stuff all the time, every day. It's always good to recap all of it. So I have focused a lot of my work over the past few years, really, on trying to protect grizzly bears in Northern Rockies and beyond. I did a webinar back in May. I don't know how many people are on here that attended that webinar, but I don't want to recap everything I talked about then. So I'm going to talk to you about kind of a newer case and issue that we've been working on. But before that, there is one case that definitely warrants some recapping, because we just got a great win this summer. So a lot of you are probably familiar with the Yellowstone grizzly bear delisting case. So back in 2017, the summer of 2017, the Fish and Wildlife Service approved a rule that would remove federal protections from grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So essentially they would be taken off the Endangered Species Act list of protected species. Almost immediately after federal protections were removed, and so grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem came under state management, Idaho and Wyoming both moved to approve trophy hunts. In Idaho, that was only 1 grizzly bear, but in Wyoming, it was 24, which shocked a lot of people. I think even the hunters were surprised that they were going to be able to kill that many bears the first year federal protections were removed. And what was really troublesome, not only that that's such a high number, but within kind of the recovery zone, they were allowed to kill 12 bears and they could only kill 1 female. But then there were another 12 bears outside of the recovery zone, and those 12 bears had no quota based on sex. So, you know, essentially all 12 of those grizzly bears could have been females, and the loss of females really impacts, you know, the population as a whole. So we filed litigation with our allies. We were actually, the center was represented by Earth Justice in that case, which is an organization I used to work for. And we filed litigation the following year, right before the hunts were approved. We won that case in the District Court of Montana. The judge issued an injunction so that the hunts could not move forward, and federal protections were essentially reinstated based on that ruling. The government filed an appeal, and so that went up to the Ninth Circuit, and that's the one we got this summer. So the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals just in July of this year affirmed that ruling, finding that you know, the federal government had not done its job and done the proper analysis before removing federal protections. So they are on the Endangered Species Act list. You know, a great victory, and we were really excited about that. I mean, for them to be protected, you know, for at least a few more years, it's possible we'll be facing this same challenge again in a few years. And of course, there's still work to be done in the Yellowstone ecosystem. We're fighting some bad projects that, you know, negatively impact habitat or allow for the take of grizzly bears by the state agencies, for example. But overall, that win did a lot to protect Yellowstone grizzly bears into the future. So we were excited about that one. The one I want to talk to you today about is grizzly bears in the North Cascades in Washington. So the North Cascades was identified by Fish and Wildlife Service as a potential recovery zone in the 1993 recovery plan. And then in 1997, there was a supplement to the recovery plan published by the Fish and Wildlife Service that confirmed that it is a recovery zone. And what that means is for grizzly bears in the lower 48 states to be fully recovered, meaning that you can remove them from the Endangered Species Act list, there needs to be a self-sustaining population of grizzly bears in the North Cascades recovery zone. And that recovery zone, the North Cascades, is one of the largest contiguous blocks of federal land in the lower 48 states. The recovery zone is about 10,000 square miles. That includes North Cascades National Park and a lot of federal lands around there. There's a lot of ample, great grizzly bear habitat in that area. Unfortunately, right now there's maybe 2 grizzly bears in the North Cascades. There used to be a pretty thriving population of grizzly bears, but you know, like grizzly bears elsewhere in the lower 48 states, they were wiped out by fur hunters and bounty programs, from the federal government and state wildlife management agencies as well. And the last monitoring effort a couple of years ago, they identified 4 grizzly bears, but they think that actually there's only 2. There were 2 different observations of 2 grizzly bears, and both of those were actually in British Columbia, so just north and adjacent to the recovery zone. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has acknowledged that human intervention is necessary to recover this population. They're not going to recover on their own. They're not connected, unfortunately, to grizzly bears elsewhere in the lower 48 states. So we really need a program to augment the population, which is done in the Cabinet Yaks and the Selkirks in northern Idaho. Essentially, you take grizzly bears from other populations and kind of drop them into these areas of great habitat and try to build the population that way until it's at a point where it's self-sustaining. So the 1997 supplement basically called on Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service to go through this process under the National Environmental Policy Act, where they would determine the best way to recover grizzly bears and what augmentation might look like. Finally, in 2017, they actually started that process. So they went through scoping, they took public comment, and then in 2017, you can see the timeline on the side here. The agencies released a draft environmental impact statement, and that DEIS included 3 action alternatives. All of them required augmentation of the population with the goal of restoring at least 200 grizzly bears to the area. So that was published, and then, you know, everything's moving forward. We filed comments, a lot of, you know, we called on our members to file comments, a lot of you did. And overall, you know, people were pretty supportive of this plan. And then in December of 2017, then Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke suddenly announced that they were terminating the project. And we were like, what is going on? No warning, nothing, just, you know, completely came out of nowhere. So we filed a request under the Freedom of Information Act to get documents to try to figure out, you know, what was going on behind the scenes. There was obviously no government transparency, which, you know, was problematic for a lot of reasons, but, you know, we needed to know what was going on. So we filed that, you know, maybe 2 days after Zinke's announcement, and we still haven't gotten any documents. So just a couple months ago, we filed a lawsuit to try to recover those documents. But in the meantime, you know, I think Zinke and the administration saw a huge backlash when he made this announcement. And just a few weeks later, completely recanted his statements, said, don't worry about it, we're moving forward. You know, I've looked into it further and we realize it's necessary and biologically makes sense. And so the process continued to move forward. They opened another round of public comments that following March, took more public comments on the draft environmental impact statement. And so we've just been waiting for the final environmental impact statement, and it's been several years, and then all of a sudden, in July of this year, Secretary Bernhardt officially terminated the environmental analysis and the recovery program, essentially. That also had no warning. We thought things were finally moving forward, and there's obviously a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that the government is not making the public privy to. So we filed another Freedom of Information Act request that they're once again ignoring, and I'm sure we'll have to file another lawsuit to get those documents. But in the meantime, you know, they terminated the analysis, and they have no other plan to recover grizzly bears in this area. It's not like they terminated it and said, we're gonna, you know, augment the population. There's just nothing. And the population there is essentially extirpated. There's maybe 2 bears, maybe none at this point. So we filed a notice of intent to sue, essentially saying that Fish and Wildlife Service is skirting their duty under the recovery plan to recover this population and to protect it. They're also skirting some obligations they have under the National Environmental Policy Act to, you know, see that process to the end and, you know, come out with a final decision based on the environmental analysis, not based on whatever they're doing behind the scenes. So we filed that notice of intent a couple days after the termination of the program. That's something that's required under the Endangered Species Act. You have to file a notice 60 days before you can file litigation. And we have just hit that 60 days. I think we will, you know, unless something changes in the near future, we'll probably be teeing up litigation pretty soon on that. So I would encourage our members to keep an eye out. I think if we do tee up that litigation, we'll definitely be asking for members to weigh in. Yeah, so that's the case I wanted to update you on today. It's kind of a newer one.
Thank you so much for sharing, Andrea. And so we have a couple minutes left before the question and answer section. So I know a lot of people are curious about the wolf delisting. Colette, do you want to briefly talk about that?
Sure. Well, yeah, we had so many members all across the country working on this effort. So I would guess that most of you are familiar with the federal government's efforts to remove protections from wolves. Just wanted to give you an update on that. We did hear in August that the final delisting rule was imminent, very imminent is what the quote was in the media. And since then, we've learned that there's this part of the government called Office of Management and Budget, that they've taken up the rule to do an economic analysis, which is quite unusual actually, and it was a surprise to us. But it's good news because it should delay the release of that final rule by at least several weeks. And this is a real critical time because if protections from wolves were removed, then the management would turn over to the states. And we know in so many states what would happen, like Minnesota, where I live, Wisconsin, Michigan, you'd see hunting and trapping season start immediately. But with this extra delay, I'm guessing that we're not going to be able to, we won't see a fall hunting season on wolves. I do want everyone to be assured that you know, when that rule comes out, we'll set up another webinar to let you know if there's any surprises in that rule and tell you our next steps, but we will definitely be litigating. We have a very strong sense that we will be able to succeed. The Fish and Wildlife Services try to do this year after year after year. Every time the court, you know, knocks them down and then they come back with an even more egregious rule. This one is the worst yet. It would remove protections from wolves all across the country. And the reasoning just doesn't make any sense. They really want to say that just because there's wolves in the Great Lakes, that's enough for recovery. So, you know, this is where we've got the current population, where we've got habitat, and the current population is just a handful of places in the Great Lakes, in the Northern Rockies, in Washington and Oregon, just a handful in California. The next slide shows how wolves are trying to disperse into these other areas. These are recorded long distance dispersal from wolves. If we just keep their protections, we'll be able to get wolves in additional places, like into the Southern Rockies, Colorado, Utah. But if protections are removed, too many states would turn to killing wolves, and we wouldn't ever get wolves again in these places there where we could see them again.
Thank you for sharing. And then really quickly, Andrea, how will our campaign for wolves shift when federal protections are removed?
Well, you know, I think if federal protections are removed, which hopefully our litigation will be successful and that will be the case, but we will have to start focusing more on state management. That's something we've actually already been doing. So I left you on a sour note with grizzly bears, so I wanted to report some good news on wolves. We had a recent win in Washington. So in Northeast Washington, wolves have been really under attack by the state management agency there, mostly on behalf of the livestock industry. They've killed dozens of wolves over the past several years. Essentially under this, based on this mismanaged protocol that permits the state to kill wolves when certain criteria are met. So for example, if there's a certain number of livestock depredations in a specified time frame, then they can issue this kill order and kill wolves. And the protocol has been really problematic. It was kind of done behind closed doors with this wolf advisory group that has a couple of people on it that are, you know, have environmental conservation values, but then it's really weighted heavily in favor of people that don't, especially the livestock industry. So they've been killing wolves under this protocol. We haven't been able to attack the protocol because it's kind of this rule that they came up with behind closed doors. So we filed a petition asking the state to go through a more formal rulemaking process under the State Environmental Policy Act. And with that, the public would have more of a chance to provide comments and really partake in the rulemaking process and let their views be known and, you know, kind of have a little more transparency as to how the state is managing wolves. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife for Washington obviously denied the petition. We didn't really expect them to approve it. We then appealed to Governor Inslee, and we were a little surprised, happily surprised, that he actually overruled the state agency and granted the petition. So the state will now have to go through this formal rulemaking process. The public will be able to weigh in. And we don't have an exact timeline for it yet, but we're hoping it might start as soon as later this fall or this winter. And that is definitely something we will be calling on our members to, you know, submit comments on, and we'll definitely have some action alerts around that when there are opportunities for public comment. So, you know, that was some good news for wolves, and definitely encourage everyone to keep an eye out for when we're asking for your input.
Awesome, thank you so much. And so with that, remember to sign up for our emails and action alerts, and that's a really easy way to support our campaigns and make sure your voice is heard. And also showing up to meetings on important environmental issues in your area, whether that's virtually, hopefully because of COVID, but yeah, and then a really easy way to get involved is going to be after this webinar ends, you'll be getting an email with a link to the action alert. So click that and you'll be able to get more information. So with that, thank you so much to Colette and Andrea for giving us so much knowledge, and then also to Karina and Tiara for running the tech. And with that, we'll head into the question and answers section. Okay, so the first question is, how do I find out if my city or county has a current contact with wildlife services?
You just need to ask them, actually. So, I did this for my own county. I Googled the county that I live in. I found their governmental webpage. There's emails and phone numbers usually listed for the various board members for the county. Just shoot them an email and ask. And it might take a while for them to get back to you, but local governments really do appreciate hearing from their constituents, and even just asking for that information starts that relationship. And then, set up a phone call with them to talk through your concerns. Reach out to me. I'll give you some talking points on that. And that's how you get the ball rolling.
Cool, thank you. And so next question is, with so much interest in being a vegetarian or vegan, shouldn't this lessen the power exerted by the cattle industry? How can a relatively small special interest group control animal policy like this?
Want to take that one, Andrea? That's a hard one.
Sure. Well, I would say the center actually has a program focused specifically almost on, how to become a vegetarian, how it is more environmentally friendly to have a vegetarian or vegan diet. There's a lot of information from that program that we disperse on a regular basis. I think, a smaller group could use just by contacting the right people. Jennifer Molitor is kind of the head of that program, I think, for the center, and Stephanie Caros. And I think contacting them and asking them for some of the leaflets and stuff that we have that information on. I'm sure they would love to distribute that to anybody who wants to use it for their own organization, or even just at a grassroots level, distributing that information to educate the public as to why being a vegetarian is, so important for the environment. Not only, so we're not supporting the livestock industry, or at least the bad players in the livestock industry, but also there's a lot of other issues that come along with a meat-based or dairy-based diet, such as concentrated animal feeding operations. There's a lot of air pollution and water pollution that comes along with those operations. And I think some of that information is also available through our program and probably on our website as well.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is, what is the center doing about the push to expand hunting on national wildlife refuges?
Yeah, I can take that one. Yeah, it's really disturbing. This year marked the largest ever expansion of hunting on national wildlife refuges. There'll be more than 2.3 million acres with that have expanded or new species, new acres open to hunting. 8 refuges that have never had hunting in the past are going to have hunting now. So yeah, we've got a litigation plan here. We're going to be challenging it in court. The first step will be a notice of intent to sue. We think there are Endangered Species Act violations. There's also violations for their environmental analysis. A lot of this, unfortunately, is the consequence of a government that has wanted to cater to trophy hunters, unfortunately, and hopefully we can beat that back through our litigation. I know, Andrew, would you want to give an example? I know that you helped on this project too with the Swan River, about how grizzly bears are under fire possibly.
Yeah, so the Swan River National Wildlife Refuge is in Montana, and they are proposing to open it up to black bear hunting. And unfortunately, that refuge is also occupied grizzly bear habitat. And one of the largest causes of death for grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies actually is either mistaken identity, so black bear hunters that are going out killing grizzly bears thinking that they're black bears, or saying that they think they're black bears. And also, unfortunately, elk hunters and deer hunters that surprise a grizzly bear and kill them in self-defense. But opening the refuge up to black bear hunting is just putting grizzly bears, under the gun in one more place where they don't need it.
Wow. Yeah, so next question is about the M44 devices. Are the locations of these M44 devices logged? Is this data available or can this be obtained via a FOIA request?
No, they're very secretive about where the devices are placed. And if you're out in the, out in the wild, there should be a sign posted. So if it's a gated area, so if it's on a private pasture, for example, they are supposed to post a sign there at the gate, or if there's fencing along any edge, they're supposed to put at least one sign. And then near the actual device, they put a sign, but that's the only way to tell. I've done lots of FOIA requests trying to get at data on M44s. Yeah, it's difficult, unfortunately. What we really need is just a ban on on their use on public lands, so that we don't have that risk when we're out recreating.
Yeah, and unfortunately, one of the problems with the signage, aside from the ones that Colette already talked about, is, like she said, you have to, if it's a gated area, put a sign up near the gate. But I know, for example, in Wyoming, there was a gated area where they had M44s, and there were 3 different ways to access that gated area, but they only had the sign up on one side of the gate. So if you accessed, from the east side instead of the north side where the sign was, you still wouldn't know.
So kind of on the topic of, on public lands and such, are people allowed to remove snares from public land if you find them, or is there a punishment for doing so?
Yeah, that depends on state law. And yeah, if it's on your own property, I don't want to give legal advice, but I'm pretty sure if it's on your own property, you should be able to remove it. But other than that, I don't think it's possible without to lawfully to remove those devices, unfortunately. Is that your understanding too, Andrea?
Yeah, I think I actually looked into this a couple of years ago. I can't remember if I looked into Wyoming or Idaho. I think it was Wyoming. And I think it was actually like a federal offense or it wasn't federal, but it almost rose to the level of a federal offense. It was a huge fine and potential jail time for tampering with traps on public lands and state lands. So also don't want to give legal advice, but I would definitely say check your state laws before thinking about doing anything like that.
Yeah, it's problematic. I know in Minnesota, we've been working on changing the state law, because right now, even your own private land is open for trappers to set traps unless you've posted, and there's these requirements you have to post like every 20 feet or something really onerous. Unless you've posted no trespassing, they're allowed to set traps on your own property. So there's a lot of real draconian laws out there, but this is something that the public's really outraged about. And there has been this real change in values, I think, over the last decade, where people really are making changes on these state laws. And hopefully we'll see things keep getting better and better.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Important to know. What you can and can't do, even if it's not legal advice. And so the next question is, how did Wildlife Services become such a rogue organization?
Yeah, that's hard to say. They've been around for for a long time. One of our coworkers, Michael Robinson, wrote the book on wildlife services and how it started back, you know, in these early predator extermination programs that led to the demise of wolves and grizzlies. That was the predecessor to the modern day wildlife services. And they just haven't caught up with modern values. They're just stuck in this, we've always done it the same way, where, you know, we've got a conflict, we just kill the animal, even though the science shows that that's not effective. And even though the public, almost every survey shows that the public is against the use of these indiscriminate devices, especially on public land. So yeah, I think it's really just because it was this way for so long, and it's just hard to get past that status quo.
Yeah, I mean, it's also got a very, you know, kind of nice name, like Wildlife Service.
Right.
I think is a good thing. And you know, until you actually dig into the data and figure out what they're doing and how many animals they're killing annually, you kind of think they're probably doing something good for the wildlife, and no need to, you know, question their work. But turns out, I think they need to be renamed personally. But
Right.
So someone had asked, how do we get wildlife services defunded?
Well, there's been legislation for years trying to accomplish that. Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, it's one of these long-term battles of raising public awareness, outrage, that eventually will transform into legislative action. That could be the top-down approach, or like we talked about earlier, that, you know, county by county type of approach where local citizens speak out and get rid of those contracts. So we're trying to work at it from both sides, but I think it is, you know, it's been easier in California, for example, where you've got, you know, real strong conservation ethic, and some of the sort of, you know, livestock heavy Western states, it's a real entrenched way of life to just be able to pick up the phone and call your wildlife services guy to come out and kill your coyote. And it's going to take a prolonged effort to get past that.
And speaking of coyotes, people don't believe coyotes can control their reproduction. Is there any solid science on studies showing this is actually possible?
Well, there definitely is science showing that coyotes are, I mean, they're responsive to their environment. The problem, so most wildlife are, I mean, they're gonna be controlled by something, right? So either they'll be limited by the habitat, or they'll be limited by the prey, or there'll be a predator that limits them, or they'll be limited by disease. What makes coyotes unique and very successful is that when they face exploitation, so when you hunt coyotes or trap them, they have this ability to rebound really easily. So they're actually a little bit different in that way, where they're not, you know, like Andrea talked about how sensitive grizzly bears are to, you know, if you just kill a few females, you can really change the trajectory of the population. It's actually different with coyotes. They're not quite so sensitive. Which is why they kill thousands and thousands every year, and the population of coyotes is basically still increasing. So they're a little bit different than a lot of typical wildlife. Andrea, do you have something to add to that? I'm kind of fumbling.
well, I mean, if I remember the science correctly, I think, doesn't it show that if, you know, when the population is wiped out, or, you know, someone's trying to wipe out the population, don't they actually have like higher litters, like, you know, they give birth to more pups than they would if the habitat is, you know, if they're habitat limited, or limited in some other way that you talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my understanding too. Yeah.
And pivoting a little bit, and this may be our last question, but has anyone ever tried to implement a predator-friendly program label for selling products to force ranchers to become more predator-friendly? Kind of dolphins-friendly tuna or free-range eggs, chicken.
Yeah, I know that those exist, but I don't know much about it. Andrea, do you?
Can you read the question again? I want to make sure I'm understanding it before I try to answer it.
Has anyone ever tried to implement a predator-friendly program, like a label for selling products that would force ranchers to become more predator-friendly? And the example was dolphin-friendly tuna or like free-range eggs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I know here we sell, you know, it says like grass-fed cattle or organic, but I don't think I've ever seen something that says like wolf-friendly cattle or wolf-friendly beef or anything like that.
I had a former intern who his previous life was working at a ranch where they used their ranch as wildlife habitat, and they didn't kill any predators there, and they just had that was part of their marketing strategy. I don't think I'm quite sure there's not like a certified predator friendly, label, but I'm quite confident that that's an individual marketing for certain ranches.
Yeah, I think that ranch that we went to for the endangered species program a few years ago, Beaver Ranch in Montana, was similar. I mean, they raised cattle, but they had grizzly bears and wolves and, considered them native animals and protected them on their landscape. So I think there are a lot of ranches like that, but I'm not sure there's an actual label.
Pretty cool though, something to think about. But so we're pretty much out of time for today, and we still have quite a few questions left, but hold those questions for tomorrow from 12 to 1 p.m. on Slack. And Andrea and Colette will answer them then. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining the webinar today, and can give yourselves a round of applause, and thank you to our speakers and Karina and Tiara for running the tech. You'll be receiving an email with the action alert, and I believe the link to sign up for the Slack if you're not on it already. So stay tuned, keep an eye out for that, and we'll see y'all soon.
Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.